Her name is Diana Alvarez-Marin, and she is the co-author of the book Quantum City. And she derived her research from that book, and now she will present the research entitled Atlas of Indexical Cities, Articulating Personal City Models on Generic Infrastructure Ground. So I will let her explain you what is it about, and I'm pretty sure it's on the let's say background of how we've been discussing this idea of map and models. So welcome, Diana.
Thank you. Okay, so today I'm gonna present or introduce you an atlas, but this atlas is a little bit special. It's not an atlas that is made out of maps, but it's an atlas which is made out of models. And why is made out of models? Because with the digital, somehow we need to find new points of reference, because as we know, the digital is not actually something that we can see, because it's something that we are articulating in the intellect, so something more abstract. And so the first question that this atlas wants to tackle is, how do we move through cities if we have access to absolutely all spaces and places of the planet? Because all of a sudden, if we have this idea of globality and we need all the time come back to a local, there's this pendular movement. And this is something let's say, relatively new. And also, what is beautiful about working with this indexical idea and working with the global and the local at the same time is that you can approach the idea of atmosphere. So, for example, you could ask, where could I go if I like temples or if I like gods? And then you find some directionality. And at the same time, you could also ask for the identity of a city. For example, what is Berlin Ness? It's something that is very soft. It works like a flavor or like a smell. So we are able to deal with these kind of things. And not only we work in this movement from global to local, but we are able to start jumping from local to local. So if I get a sense of what Berlin-ness could mean, then I could ask, okay, I like this. Where can I find Berlin-ness in Mumbai? And in New York? And so on. So the ways in which navigate through these indexical cities are not geometrical directly, they are not physical, but we are jumping in this kind of topological digital space. And this has a strong relationship with perspective, with the perspective of the Renaissance. Because what happened with perspective of the Renaissance 600 years ago is that it changed the position of man in the universe. So all of a sudden we took the position that was given to God, the God that is able to see and somehow say what reality is. So all of a sudden man takes this position, and what happens with the digital today is a very similar moment. In an abstract, if you take it from an abstract point of view, is extremely similar, because again, the position of man in the universe is changing, but what's interesting now is that there's not just one center, but there's a multiplicity of centers that are working simultaneously at the same time. And this relates to this idea of the global and the local that are continuously working together. I want to read a quote from a very amazing author, Jean Berger, who wrote Ways of Seeing. You can look it up on Google, it's an amazing reference. He talks about the perspective renaissance. He says, the convention of perspective centers everything on the eye of the beholder. It's like a beam from a lighthouse, only instead of light traveling out, appearances travel in. The conventions call those appearances reality. Perspective makes the single eye the center of the visible world. Everything converges on the eye as to the vanishing point of infinity. The visible world is arranged for the spectator as the universe was one thought to be arranged for God. Okay, so how do we position this question today? Yeah, because we are not in one single center anymore. There's more and more centers, and what this means is that if we are not only the center, there are also other sorts of beings that cohabit with us, and we somehow need to negotiate and to give them some kind of space. And I want to call those beings other sorts of intelligence. So we're talking maybe of artificial intelligence, and we're saying maybe that we are also in a continuous negotiation between human intelligence and machine intelligence. So it's interesting to think how these technologies of communication inform us about these ways of seeing, and also about the ways of talking. And the talking, what I mean with talking is how we decide we want to appear in public space. And what's beautiful is that the idea of public space is also re-articulated, and this comes later. Okay? So, considering this multi-center condition and the idea that digital technologies decouple from time and space, so they go to the abstract, they give us access to simultaneous perception of reality. My question is, what could be the projective geometry, the perspective geometry of the digital? Because, okay, and my hypothesis would be that in ancient Greece was done through writing with Euclidean geometry. So Euclidean geometry were not drawings, were really like a written set of instructions. In Renaissance, we would say that it's through drawing, like what we have with Brunelleschi, Alberti, later on. And then today, if it's something that we cannot see, could it be that the perspective of geometry is something that is articulated through coding? And I would like to quote also again one of the books that's coming out from the chair, the Atlas of Digital Architecture, where it says, with today's digital tools, all we need to create our architecture is an algebraic solver of linear equations written as code. Okay? So what it means is basically that the perspective of the digital is not all this BIM stuff, or is not all this CAD stuff. Because basically what this does is that it mimics a moment that has already passed, which is the moment of drawing. But if it's something more abstract, then how is this perspective being articulated? Also if it's outside of space of time. And of course, what we see is not the model itself. What we see is the collapsing of the model into some kind of render. But the operational space where we as architects can really act and articulate is a space which is totally abstract. So today I will collect a multiplicity of possible digital perspectives under a common narrative, and each one of these models, so you see I made a relationship with the model and the perspective. I treat the perspective as a model. Each one of these models works like a small atlas. And what an atlas does is that it tries to reconstitute the idea of continuum. So we have somehow the perception that reality is continuous. When we touch something, when we see the landscape, we have the perception that it doesn't stop. But what an atlas does is that it gives you many indexes in order to reconstitute this continuum. So let's say that it's some kind of indexical approximation. And these constructions give us hints about this planet that we want to discover, but in order to discover this planet is not a neutral action. You need to have a preference, or you need to have an inclination of how you discover this reality. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump from model to model, and when we're jumping from one model to another, it's not a physical jump in space. It's a topological jump. And this topology means that we are jumping through models that are similar to one another. It's like you're woven into a fabric. And this is the way of navigating in this labyrinth of the plenty, if we think of the plenty of data as some kind of really chaotic, like you're in the ocean and you're like, how do I navigate this thing? And at the end, this full constellation of models through which we're going to navigate, this will be an atlas again, which means that we are working with an atlas that is made of atlases. So it's very beautiful. You begin of something and you start entering into the infinitely small. And there's also another really cool story about Atlas. Atlas was a titan who was doomed by the gods to carry the celestial vault on his shoulders. And what's really nice is that we can think of this vault, of this celestial vault that is carrying on his shoulders. This is a model. It's a model because it is articulated in relation of all the figures that surround it, and there's always an external source of light that projects and collapses the model to the real, where you can touch it and you can measure it again. And this is exactly what we do with perspective. There's an act of projection in perspective. And let's think of the model. He's carrying it here, so it's like a head, a capital, and this head keeps on circulating and keeps on changing. It's not fixed, because we want to create a model for each one of us, and it's not only us who are changing the model by changing the way we project ourselves in what we see, but the model is changing because the question we're making is different, or the city that we are looking at is different. So this is this really architectonic play of singular figures that keep on moving. And and let's take this articulation of singular figures as a way of connecting multiple localities while keeping this relationship to a global. So one of my favorite references on Atlas, the Atlas Mnemosyne of Warburg. And what's beautiful about this is literally this infinitesimal approximation that I'm talking about. So it consisted of 40 wooden panels covered with black cloth on which nearly 1,000 pictures from books, magazines, newspapers, and other daily life sources are pinned, containing no captions and only a few text. So only the index is there to tell you the story he's telling. So it means that things inside this atlas, they talk only through relationships. So Mnemosyne is addressing the tension between the continuity of reality, the discreteness of our partial representations of the real, and the gluing of these representations. So we want to glue these things to the atlas. And this effort tends towards dissolving borders and gives emergence to the continuous, the blurry and the indeterminate, by paradoxically introducing minimal variations of a theme, like an infinitesimal approximation towards it. So as I said before, trying to imitate this gesture, I will attempt to approach our contemporary cities, our cities of today, in this indexical, infinitesimal, and probabilistic manner. So there's something really amazing which has happened with digital technologies today, is that they are completely decentralized. So we live in cities, messages travel super fast. And the thing with these decentralized devices is that they are both super local. You have the phone in your hand, but at the same time, this thing has an influence on the whole planet. So it's both local and global. Or think, for example, of satellite technology. In just a click, you have access to information about the totality of the planet. And there's a French philosopher, Michel Serres, who already thought about this situation. He called these objects world objects. So he says that world objects, they are tools with a dimension that is commensurable with the one of the dimensions of the world. A satellite for speed, an atomic bomb for energy, the internet for space, nuclear waste for time. These are 4 examples of world objects. And what is amazing is that, let's say before we reach this decentralization of technology that we have today, world objects were only, let's say, natural, like a glacier, or a huge canyon, or the ozone layer that is covering the earth. Never before we had these human-made objects that reach the scale of the planet, or for example, like we have this with cities, and this also question the idea of what is nature. And as the number of these world objects increases, we start realizing that, first of all, it changes our idea of what the global is. It gives a new understanding of globalization. And what's amazing also is that we have more devices than people who are using them. Okay, so I think of that. Like every person of the planet, okay, I know not in every country, but maybe very soon, every person of the planet has maybe at least 3 devices. So all of a sudden, and these devices are producing information all the time. They are sensing reality and giving this kind of information. And then all of a sudden you start questioning, can we still call these objects objects and the subjects who use them subjects? Because the relationship gets a little bit blurry. And this brings me to the idea of questioning who is who is talking and who is listening, or who is observing and who is being observed. This becomes a little bit melted, and this allows me to create a little fiction about who could be the beings who are using these world objects, and who could be the inhabitants of the city of indexes. And as I said before, with the idea of cohabitation with other sources of intelligence, this comes into the game, because these world objects, they are accessible to humans, but they are also accessible to machine intelligences. And I could say, for example, that a social network is a world object. And there's some kind of parasitic relationship between each one of us and those world objects. And what I mean with parasitic is that I feed them with information. As I feed them, I modify them, and they feed me back with some perception of reality that was given because I fed them in a certain way. So it's really interesting. This relationship is really tight. So these cities of indexes are inhabited by multiple natures, different kinds of intelligence, but the only thing we know is that no one is native to these cities. So no one was born in the cities of indexes. You might become a citizen, but you might become a citizen by engaging into certain contracts. Maybe you accept to be digital literate, which is the language that they might speak in the cities. And these citizens of the cities of indexes, they cultivate their own identities by differentiating themselves in relation to the community, and by defining what public space is for them. And these world objects, they allow them to be in many different places at the same time. I mean, this we know it. This is what we do, and have access to the entire world. And what is really beautiful with this is that they don't make any longer a distinction between what is virtual and what is real, because they live in both spheres at the same time. And so these citizens, they are able to step between these two worlds without needing to accept like a fixed ground of belonging. So they can be hybrid in that sense. And they can also move through the porous spaces of what we call, for example, public and private, or distant and close. And it's not this binary thing that I'm purely public or I'm public private. It's really in different intensities and degrees. It's like you're in a spectrum. And the way in which the citizens appear is through avatars, masks, and personal brands, which is pretty much how we behave in the internet. Which means I am me, but when I'm behaving on this digital public space, I can have many different avatars depending on the face that I want to use to talk. And it doesn't mean that they are fake. It doesn't mean that it just means that it's a part of me. I'm just choosing the way in which I want to talk. And and I think that is through talking or through articulating these avatars is how the citizens of the citizens of the city of indexes, they learn how to behave in public space, or they learn how to articulate public space. And this is a big question today, because everybody's saying, okay, today what is public and what is private? Because it's no longer the story that you go outside to the main square of the city and you are totally public. You can be totally private while you are outside, because you're communicating on your phone, and you can be totally public in your bedroom because you're displaying certain information or you're showing an avatar. So this becomes really blurred, and I think that us, as cities or the cities of indexes, perhaps we need to learn how to articulate these things, how to be private when we want to be private, and how to be public when we want to be public. So the models that I'm going to show you today, they have a lot to do with this. And these models, we can think of them as an instrument or a navigation instrument for the planet. Okay, so right now I have presented you the planet, I have presented you the aliens, and the aliens need to learn how to navigate in this planet. So in order to navigate in this planet, they need an instrument of navigation. And it's not about having a technical instrument, it's about having an architectonic instrument. Architectonic because we are articulating things in a very masterful way, and this navigation instrument is not a generic thing that everybody has. this navigation instrument is articulated for you by your preference and your inclination, your intentionality. So think of this instrument as a little crystal, something precious and beautiful. It shines, you can hold it in your hand, you can put it in your pocket, and you take it anywhere you go. And as the constellation of cities that we decide to visit is going to change, we're going to use this instrument, and there will be some external source of light, like with the atlas, that is going to go through it and is going to give us a projection. So which means that the source of light is not given, it's always changing depending on the constellation that you're playing with. Which means that the instrument cannot give you the absolute right way to navigate, but gives you a pertinent way to navigate depending on your question and depending on the galaxy that you're playing with. So let's say that this instrument is like a personal search engine for the planet, and this is the kind of question that you could make to this instrument. Okay? And from here, so let's take of search engines that we know of today. So of course the most famous is Google, that is already 20 years old. So Google was presented for the first time by Sergey Brin and Lawrence Page in 1998 in the paper The Anatomy of Large-Scale Hypertextual Web Search Engine. And the algorithm that they use, the PageRank, introduced for the first time this dynamic hierarchy on the web that would give a certain grading according to the visibility and the importance of each website, so that you were more likely to click on a link depending on the links that you clicked before. So, what's crazy about it is that this is mathematics from 1 century ago, Markov chains from the 1920s. And instead, so let's think that instead of creating a search engine that has already a sun, which is fixed, or that has already a frame, which is fixed, and what this means has already an idea, has already an idea of what the world could mean, which in my opinion is what Google search engine is doing, because they assign you a certain profile. So you are this age, you live here, you like this music, therefore you might like these things. But what happens with this is that this doesn't allow me to have these avatars. This doesn't allow me to have this multiplicity of brands that I want to have. I'm confined to what they think that I am. So what we're going to do is to articulate this personal search engine for every possible word situation, question, and observer. So it's like we have Google that gives us this frame, it's super useful, it works, etc., it's super efficient. But what if we take a step back? We face the plenty and the chaos again, and we articulate the machine on our own. So I think that nowadays there's all these big discussions, and many people complain or are afraid, the big players possess our data, but I don't think that's the only problem. I think that the problem is that the big players impose models. And I think that we can, if we are digital literate, we can do something on that. So this personal search engine functions like an instrument. We said already, like a navigation instrument, and it will point in a probabilistic manner, so like we saw in the PageRank algorithm, towards places that we have never been to. But we have an idea of places that we have never been to, because we can give indexes in an atmospheric way. I like places that are a bit blue and are warm, and where there's dogs. There are just many places like this, and I don't need to have been there, but I can give you an atmospheric idea of what these places could be. So in order to do this, we're going to play with millions of spaces and places of our planet. And so we will need a tremendous amount of data, and this data will orchestrate both the granularity, so this very, very small scale, and at the same time the vastness of the globality of the world objects. And what I'm calling world objects right now will be social networks, specifically Instagram, and satellite mapping technologies, specifically Google Maps. Okay, and these are the cities, for example, that we could play with. let's say 1,000, like the actors of the movie, and we're going to think of cities as actors. Oh, wait, we come back here. Okay, okay, I wanted to do 1,000 cities, but today I'm going to show you 50. But it's already a lot. Okay, so through the act, already by the act of selecting certain cities, I'm deciding in which way I'm going to visit them. I'm already deciding which is our galaxy today or our definition of the world today. Because as we know, there's a difference between what we call planet and what we call the world. The planet is perhaps the physical thing where we live, etc. But the world, each one of us has a world. So we're articulating the world by choosing the cities that we're going to visit. And we're also going to leave behind this clear distinction between global and local, generic and specific, because we are going to be all the time in this pendular movement between the two. And so these positions will be entangled. And we will cut out the cities of the continuity of the planet. We will select them, encode them, play with them, and decode them again. And already by choosing these 50 cities, so we're showing some interest, some inclination. This choice is not exhaustive, is not fixed. It can be otherwise, we can change it, we can take 2 out, we can put 3 more. It doesn't matter. Just for now, it's a library or it's a favorite cut, a favorite selection of cities. And we are going to approach the cities through different ways of looking at them. So we're going to approach them today in space and time. And what I call space and time, I'm going to call it spaces and places. Okay? So spaces that happen in space and time that happens in place. And there's a really interesting geographer. His name is Yifu Tuan, a Chinese geographer who works on this idea of space and place. I'm going to quote him. He says, "What begins as undifferentiated space becomes place as we get to know it better and endow it with value. Architects talk about the spacious qualities of place. They can equally speak of the locational qualities of space. The ideas of space and place require each other for definition. If we think of space as that which allows for movement, then place is pose. Each pose in movement makes it possible for location to be transformed into place." Okay, so just to resume, basically he talks that space is more like this kind of empty container that allows for things to happen, and we have some kind of a collective agreement on what a space could be, but the place only emerges as this space is activated by the things that we're able to do with it and by the meaning that we give it. So this is the distinction that I would make between the two. And what is pretty amazing is that they are orthogonal to one another. And by it means with this is that if you think in terms of space, you will only see space. And if you think in terms of place, you cannot see the space. Just keep this idea for now. It's like either you're living in time, in space, or either you're living in time. Because space allows for movement, but time is like you're making cuts. Think of a section in a building. It's like time is a floor plan, it's wide. This is space, or this is space. Space is a floor plan, is wide. And time is when you start making sections. And you can make an infinity of sections. And these sections are like statues, because in order to make a section, you need to kill time. So time is dead. And, okay, so space is geometric and spatial, while place is harmonic and temporal. And I'm going to call these domains. And I'm going to represent each one of these domains, here we have them, by a different data set. So for space, I'm going to use Google Maps. And for time, I'm going to use Instagram. So Google Maps, I could say that it happens in space, and Instagram is something that happens in time. And think that Google Maps, it only has this view, this absolute view of the satellite machine that Google set up in a very specific way with very specific setups, etc., etc. And everybody in the planet has the same view. But with Instagram, it's like, imagine that the air is full of eyes, and every single eye is giving you a shot of what's going on at a certain moment. So we will consider spaces and places not as specific instances, but we will work with them as essence or as flavors, which are not pure. Therefore, we're gonna, when they become essence, when it's a specific case, we call it space and place. When it's an essence, we call it spaceness or placeness. Don't worry, it sounds weird, but later you will see how we do that. And and the challenge that comes, so we have space, time. They are not able to communicate with one another because they are in different domains. So this is my obstacle or my interrogation. And in order to, let's say I don't want to hit against the obstacle, so I'm going to avoid it. I'm going to go more abstract. And once I go more abstract, I will make my question up there and come down again. And when I go more abstract is when I go to this idea of the flavor or the aroma. And the third element that I could say would be the communication bridge between these two. We're going to call it eventness. So there's event and there's eventness. And eventness is not a concept I invented. It's a concept that comes from literature. It was invented by a Russian philosopher called Mikhail Bakhtin. And what Bakhtin says about eventness is that it's not an abstract universal system that can use across all cultures of time. It's not generic, but it's a very specific way in which the world can be perceived as an emerging event in each unique, particular, and singular situation. So what he says is that the eventness is the probability that an event might happen or not. But in order to collapse the eventness, you always need a subject that comes and make a choice. So someone needs to come and collapse it. Otherwise, it stays in this atmospheric kind of flavor thing. So if we think again of the digital perspective, again, the flavor space is this projective plane where the geometral or all the plausible views of the perspective are being articulated, and the collapsing is when I get my specific render. So I say, I really like this view. This is where I want to go. Okay, so now we have a trivium of concepts. We have spaceness, we have placeness, we have eventness, and let's call it a trivium. So if we make a trivium, we have the relationships. I know I'm not gonna go too much into this because it's a little bit too much. But what I was doing here was to find the direct relationship with the perspective of the Renaissance. Because in the perspective of the Renaissance, we say, have you heard of the words iconography, orthography, and scenography before? Anyone? Somehow, huh? So what I think is Alberti, he says about the perspective of the Renaissance is that in order to make a perspective drawing, you need iconography. Iconography, Vitruve invented this word. Iconography is the plan, the floor plan. You need orthography. Orthography is the section. And the scenography is the projective plane where the section and the plan meet. And the projective plane is pure potential. Why? Because when you make a perspective, you can take any angle. It's only frozen from the moment that you choose that angle. So it's very similar in that sense. And think that Brunelleschi, when he did the first perspective of the Renaissance, he used a mirror. And in that mirror, he was drawing the perspective. And think of a mirror. A mirror is full of potentials because it's able to reflect anything, but a mirror is nothing at all. So this is the way in which we could think of this abstract plane. Okay, so we have these three elements. So we could say, as I said before, spaceness is the horizontal. There's the space that deploys horizontally. Placeness is time, and time goes up. And as time goes up, spaceness is getting larger and larger. It's getting more capacious. And as it's circulating, I have this pendulum between the active subject and objectivity. Remember, we said this distinction doesn't matter. We are in the pendular movement between the two. And what I need at last is the eventness is the inclination or the diagonal, and this is what allows me to collapse into a specific event. Okay, so Google Maps, everybody knows it, web mapping service developed by Google, and what is interesting about this, as I said before, we have an impression that this is fully objective, but what is fully objective is simply that they are giving us like the setup of a certain machinery, and Google decided how it should be. And we are going to say that this evokes all spaces out of time and one observer. That's it. And this one observer is the eye of Google Maps. And these satellite images, they give us a specific render of the world formatted to this machinery. And here we have physical objects, buildings, streets, trees, rivers, seen from above, and they are offered to the person who knows how to read a map or a plan. And on the other side, the source of data that we associate with place is Instagram. And Instagram is of a different nature. In Instagram, we can think that every time that we take a picture, we are like a witness. We are creating evidence of something that has happened. And with Instagram, we can say what's important is not the object that is being photographed. What's important is that you take this picture at moment X or moment Y. Because pictures of the Eiffel Tower, how many do you have? Thousands. So at the end, what matters is not the Eiffel Tower. What matters is which moment in time you killed in order to produce this image. So this is why I call it a statue. It's something is like a testimony that a witness gives, and it is dead. So the Instagram witness map within my chosen 50 cities will evoke all times, out of space, and all observers. So you see the inversion. In the previous we had all spaces, out of time, and one observer. Here we have all times, out of space, and all observers. And all observers, we can say the 800 million users that Instagram has. And on Instagram, what do we have? We have human faces, landscape, scenery, food, historical photos, animals. And this is a different kind of information. This is offered from person to person. It's not for experts. And let's say that all these images surround us in abundance. And the more we have of them, the less they make sense, because it's more of a mess. And so how do we create a communication channel between isolated perceptions of reality in a way that we can project our intention? Okay, so I start with our galaxy, our chosen cities of the planet, and I'm gonna do something that we call modulation. And modulation, as you see, is a word that comes from model. And it has to do with the act of creating a model. And a model has a mode, and a mode is a manner, which means that there's some kind of soft factor in the way in which you choose to have a certain model. So it's like you are asked, how do I touch this? How do I cut it? And I think that the definition of the module has a lot to do with the question that we are asking to the model. And okay, so we choose a dimension that is going to address our interests. For this one time, I chose surfaces of 200 meters by 200 meters because I thought, okay, I want to be in a space that I'm able to perceive at one glance. But it doesn't have to be like this, it could be otherwise. So with this, in the upper part, let's say that we have a bag of spaces out of time. And with Instagram is already discretized, because these are cuts of space in time. So they don't have length, they don't have area, they don't have volume, they cannot be measured in a spatial sense, but they can be manifest within frequency. So they are a little bit like music. Music happens in time, which means that a certain kind of picture can happen several times or can have resonance with other kinds of pictures. So the second data set, we can say that we have a bag of times out of space. So in total, we will collect up, we have 20,000 satellite images for now, and down we have 500,000 Instagram posts distributed among the 50 cities of our planet. And in relation to the conceptual diagrams that we were seeing before. So let's think that spaces are able to host places in the same way in which pieces of time can resonate within a given space. So let's say this is somewhere in Sao Paulo, I think, in Brazil, and in this space, these things are likely to happen. Simple, okay? And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this to the abstract space of flavors, How do we do this? So we encode it, which means that we go to a symbolic level and we are living the world of meaning, sense, semantics. So we don't know any longer that this is a bus, or that this is a house, or that this is a building. All these things are lost, and we're going to transform this into vectors. And a vector is simply a list of numbers, and the list of numbers is just created relationally, which means based on how the picture relates to other pictures in the data set. And of course, a matrix, it has no meaning, and it's something that you cannot perceive with your senses. And so I'm gonna do this with absolutely every picture. So I'm encapsulating this in a meaningless way. And this encoding will allow us to operate on this abstract level. And this is when the machine intelligence comes into the game. Okay, so it's nice, Each one of us has a different role. Each one of us is doing what we are better at. And what is also really beautiful about this idea of symbolizing things is you could think of this matrix as a map of intensities. So the idea of what is a photograph? A photograph is a recording of light. You're simply recording light. So it's like you come to the very concept of what photography is. This matrix is a map of intensities of light, let's say, for instance. And these n-dimensional vectors, they are meaningless to us, but they are amazing for a machine intelligence that is going to operate with them, and is going to transfer them again to a lower dimension. And in this lower dimension, we come in again and we see what's going on. And what we get here is an interesting arrangement of things. So before we had these really messy millions of images, and now they are starting getting some relationality, or they are getting some positions. And we're going to call these arrangements of things as lexicons. And a lexicon is like a dictionary, but what's different between a lexicon and a dictionary is that a lexicon always has a specific theme. So you have a lexicon for cooking, a lexicon for biology, etc., etc. And a lexicon is made out of lexemes. And what's interesting about a lexeme, which makes it different from a word, is that a lexeme is always the base form of all the words that it can create. So think, for example, in English of the verb run. You say runs, run in past tense, run in present, you say running, etc., etc. If you think of run as a lexeme, it's only run. It means that the lexeme has the potential to be it contains all the inflections at the same time. So it's like compressed information. And so it's never the thing itself. The thing itself would be the inflection, but the lexeme is on the level of the concept or on the level of the flavor. Okay, and this is how it will look. So the resolution is not so good here, but each one of these little squares is a lexeme, which means that if you open it, if it was a drawer, all the inflections are inside. We're gonna zoom in and we're gonna have a look. Okay, and this is how it would look if you were in the middle of a sphere and you were looking at these arrangements of things circulating around you. Okay, but there's no personal projection yet. You're just seeing what's happening here. You have nightlife. Here you have some lakes. Here you have some people, and food is up there, etc., etc. Okay, and using as frame the relationship between space and place, so we have these two lexicons. The one on space, I'm going to call it spaceness, is the one with the spectrum colors. And the one on place, which is up there, I'm going to call it placeness. Okay, and each one of these lexemes is simply compressed information and it contains both the universal and the singular, because it contains the aroma, but it contains the inflections. Okay, and here we have the lexemes, the lexicon of spaceness, and this is how you would see if you would standing in the middle of it. Let's call this a panorama. Okay, and here are my alphabets. My lexicons. And these lexicons, let's say that these are our first operative models. So they're a little bit primitive because there's no intentionality yet, but they give me an idea of some kind of order. And still they don't communicate between one another. So let's have a closer look inside these lexemes. And we know that each one of these lexemes evokes something like a concept, a distinction, an atmosphere, a flavor, a quality. So here are a few climatic distinctions of spaceness in the world. Okay, so here I will have all the inflections for water. This is maybe somewhere in the mountains, highways, dense urban fabric, European cities. This looks Asia or South America, something really dense. This is like industrial areas, countryside, suburban, and so on. And we can do exactly the same with Instagram. So we can look for the climatic distinctions of placeness in the world, without forgetting that these renderings are super generic. There's no projection, there's no personal projection yet. Okay, and here we have like lights at night, groups of people, colorful things, food, beer, architecture, selfies, cars, dogs and puppies and hair, doors, cappuccino, everybody takes pictures of cappuccinos, nail work, fashion selfies, and so on. Okay? So let's start by studying closely what happens with spaceness and what can we do with spaceness. Because, okay, now we have two lexicons, and there's a lot that we can do with them already. Okay? So we can consider that each space of a city, so let's say a real space of a city, can be addressed in an abstract manner, which means that I can address it as the name of the lexeme that it has, that is S2356. And since I know the location of this thing and the relation and the location of all the others, I can place it again on a map of intensities. Okay, which means that I can place the lexeme in a map of intensities in relationship to all the others, and all of a sudden I get the city as a map, not as a model. And what's beautiful about this is that you can start creating relationships, which means that you can say, my neighbor, I have a neighbor up, I have a neighbor to the right, I have a neighbor to the left, and I have a neighbor to the south. And all of a sudden what you get is a graph. So your city becomes a little creature, becomes a creature made out of relationships. So this will give, let's call this the lexical graph of spaceness. And this graph contains all the nodes or connections of the map, but it's not the map itself. And this graph is invisible. It's decoupled from space because it's pure relationship, but it can be rendered in a multiplicity of graphics. And each unique node in this graph, it stands for a bundle of spaces gathered in spaceness. So remember, each node is a lexeme, which means that if you open it up, you have a bunch of spaces inside. Okay? And so here we have the graph, and here we will have a probable graphic. And it will give us an idea of the kind of spaceness that happens within a city. And I can do this for each city of our planet, of our world, and this tell us this, and this is very similar to what we find in a text. This is a bit like if you were treating a city as a text, which means that you know that usually after the subject there's a verb, and after the verb there's a complement. So it works in a very similar way. And from this graph again, for any locality, you can get graphics in a selection of cities. And what's amazing when you're working with these graphs is that you can touch graphs in different manners. Like you put glasses, And each one of the views that I have here are different ways of looking at this graph. And none of them is right or wrong. Again, this depends on the way that you want to look at this graph. This depends on the way that you want to construct your model. So let's say that today we are interested in this, vertex degree, which means what it asks is how central each one of the spacenesses is within a city. And what this allows us to do is to have a new encoding. So second level of encoding. We did one encoding and we go one more. And the second level of encoding, what we have is each one of the cities or the actors of our play that are here, they are telling us the importance of each one of the lexemes for them. So somehow they are telling us how they like to speak, in which way. So for example, Tokyo likes a lot the first lexeme. So it's very important for it, but let's say in Sao Paulo it's not so important, they don't like it, and so on and so on and so on. And what we do with this is that we can re-index spaceness. Let's create a second spaceness which is more condensed, which means at the same time it's taking into account the physical or the visual aspects of space, and at the same time is considering the relationship of these spaces between one another. And we're going to call this spaceness. So it's encapsulated, which means that each one of the lexemes of spaceness contains several spacenesses. Okay, so it's like a Russian doll, or like an onion, And what I can do with this lexicon is that I can project each one of the cities on it. So I can ask each city, which are the lexemes that you really like? And you see, you get like some kind of intensities or like heat maps, and I'm gonna call these faces. So my cities are getting faces because they are actors, and they need a mask in order to go on the scene and interact with the others. And what they do is that they look for friends. So they get close to the cities that they like. And here is not so clear because the resolution is not so good. But for example, here I have Berlin, Munich, and Paris in the lower corner. And I have up there, I have Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires, and so on. Okay? We will see it later. Okay? And again, I can look closer and I can take like a selfie of what's going on in scene. And I can look how cities are gathering. And for example, I know that South America is bordering Asia, and Scandinavia is between Australia and Europe. And these cities, as I hope and as I anticipated, they don't stay still, they move, they change positions, they mingle, and they gather. Okay, and the world, our world is reorganizing again, and they are creating different groups of friends. So here I see them when they are playing around. This is the selfie. This is how they look on the lexicon, and this is how they actually look in space. Okay, so for example, I have Melbourne, Brisbane, Auckland, Perth. And the machine never knew that this is in Australia. It has no idea. It just knows that somehow they like each other and somehow they are similar. Helsinki and Oslo, they came together somehow because they like open spaces, they like open sea. Austin and New York, maybe the high rises, and you could go on. And of course, sometimes you have surprising things that you're like, oh, it might happen that you have surprising things that you don't know. But this is interesting because you are considering a globe and replacing things against Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Vancouver, Copenhagen, Portland, Amsterdam, Moscow, Rome, Düsseldorf, Dublin, and so on. Okay, London, Paris, Munich, Milan, Berlin. So it kind of seems to be consistent. It kind of tells us a narrative that makes sense for what we know. And at the same time when we have this, we're able to project these intensities back in space. And what we get here, for example, are maps of the most iconic places of each city. And I could also ask, okay, show me Barcelona-ness in regards to space-ness. So it's going to tell me, go here where the yellow is if you want to find Barcelona-ness in regards to space-ness. But if you want to find it in the other cities, go here. So for example, we see that there are cities that have no relationship whatsoever with Barcelona, for example, like London. But maybe there are cities where there's plenty of things like Barcelona. I don't know, for example, Santos. And you can see how this looks in space, huh? And I'm gonna go quickly through this. And Dubai, Minneapolis is pretty lonely. It's like parking lots and suburban. Oslo, and in Oslo you see rapidly is open spaces, and so on. Okay, but then what I'm gonna create is I'm gonna take these cities that like a lot one another and create something that I call eigenfaces, which means that together they can represent it as one single face. And again, I can render this again. And I can look why they're similar or where I find the transitions. And what I could do here is either create a new filter and say, actually, I only like these two or these three, and you make your own lexicon again. Okay, let's say we have a new lexicon, is this. Okay, so it's important to say that these views are partial. They are generic in the sense that we have not yet projected our personal preference, but we are on the way. Okay? So the question that we will have now is how to relate this to placeness. Now we come back to the idea how to create this bridge between the two. So let's have a look into placeness. And before doing this, I have another quote about the creation of placeness out of space. So, by Michel Serres. So, space by multiplication, place by implication. To fill up the hiatus of the extremely small to the immense, the gesture of the application is worth more than many others. The fold implies the volume and begins to build the place, of course, but by multiplication or multiplicity, its folding will end up filling space. Towards the small or the large, the fold allows to shift from place to space. Okay, so it means that, let's say that you have the space as a departing point, and you start folding it, and filling it up until you get place. So this is what we're gonna try to do. So let's say that any locality of the world, any concrete locality, we come back to the example that we had before, this place in Sao Paulo, it's able to contain a multiplicity of places, which are the green points. And what I know of these places or these things in time is that they exist here too. Okay, in the same time that the space exists somewhere here inside. So we can index each space or place with the lexeme, and what it happens when we do that is that we decouple from space and place, and we go to this level of the flavors, of the smells and the flavors. So we can say that inside this spaceness, several places take place, and we can describe a concrete locality as an abstract locality if we refer spaces and places as spaceness and placeness. Spaces and places as spaceness and placeness, which means that I take them out of space and time and I take them to this abstract thing. Let's call this an abstract locality. And an abstract locality can be represented as a graph, which means that anything that happens here, it's a bundle of relationships, which means that a certain spaceness is the catalyzer or the motivation for these things to happen simultaneously. And this is what I mean with resonance, is that it's not that one thing happens because a previous happened and so on, but it's because several things tend to happen together at the same time and creating some kind of placeness. Okay? And out of this graph again, I can do another encoding, which is here. And this encoding is similar to counting the frequencies within which a certain placeness is happening. And I can reindex this as this third lexicon that we were talking about, the eventness. Okay, so right now I have three lexicons. I have spaceness, I have placeness, and I have eventness. And we can think of this eventness as the quality of the cyclic actions that build places in the spaces of a city. So the quality within which these things might happen at the same time. I have examples. So think of these experiences, universal experiences of city life. So everybody knows what it means to go to the market, or to go grocery shopping, or to go for a walk in a park. Let's say that these experiences of the city are universal, but they might be localized because the experience of the city in the market, of being in the market, is not the same in Zurich as is in Barcelona. Okay? So what the eventness addresses is this universal atmospheric thing of this experience of city life. The event is when it happens in Barcelona. Okay, another example, for example, and the way in which you talk about the eventness, the atmospheric thing, it's always in lexical. So think, for example, what does it mean a day at the museum? So all of a sudden what comes to mind is pieces of art, paintings, sculptures, maybe selfies next to a super nice building, and so on. And there's no, as I said before, there's no causality on these things come together. There's no linear order. They just happen to happen at the same time and happen in resonance. And as I said before, this eventness, it always needs to be collapsed by an observer. Okay, so here we have our three dictionaries. They are not exactly the same, but I'm going to skip this part to shorten a little bit. But this is like a condensed, these are tables, and these tables are condensed versions of the lexicons that we had before. Which means that what they do is that they talk about the intensity within which each lexeme happens in each city. And these tables will be the entry doors to the space of possibility or the space of the perspective projection. I'm zooming in. And if you look inside, each lexeme contains a multiplicity of lexemes. This is why they say they are condensed. And of course, they allow me to create phases. And what I see is that there are three different kinds of phases. And I'm going to call these different scenes that I have here ways of talking. Because the ways of talking is every time that a city assumes a certain lexicon, is going to talk in a different manner. And they are going to gather in meaningful ways, and every time they gather with different lexicons, they are telling different stories. None of them is true or false, but each story is consistent within itself. Okay, and what we want to do, if we say that eventness is this connection bridge between these two, what it allows us to do is to create a translation, which means I can enter through spaceness, go through eventness, and go through placeness. It's a translation, and you can do this in a circular manner, in any direction. And let's say me or you as an observer, you can project yourself on these tables by asking a question about something you're curious about. Okay, so for example, this would be the eigenfaces or of these cities that they decided to gather in a certain way. For example, here we have a cluster of post-Soviet cities. Here we have Nordic cities. Here we have Western European cities. And what's happening here is the lexemes of each one of them. So they are it's like they are talking. They are telling us which lexemes they are interested in. Okay, so let's take one of them and let's see what happens. We are collapsing now. We are showing interest. Let's say I'm interested in the placeness of Cologne, Paris, Berlin, and Lyon. And what we see, it's a certain render of indexes of what these cities might be about. So we have like monuments and historic architecture, large views over the city, selfies of people, some nightlife, some artworks up there, and a little bit of food here. And what I can do is to do several collapsings or several renders. And what I see is that these are inflections, which means that they are very similar, but the flavor, they are different, but they are similar, which means that the flavor and the relationship between these indexes remain. So again, I have the same, like monuments, architecture, large views, people, artwork, nightlife, etc., etc. So that this might give us an idea of what this Europeanness might be about. But at the same time, we're able to translate the spaceness into placeness. And it's not just that I take the geolocation of the thing and I collapse it. No, it's really that I'm informing, that I'm not predicting, but you're able to inform yourself about which are the spaces that are most likely to host this kind of places. And this is what I get. So what I get is like a very European kind of field with the large avenues, the diagonals, the crossings with the obelisk, etc., etc. And we can enter the space of possibilities through the other door. So before we enter through placeness, let's say we want to enter through spaceness. And when I enter through spaceness, we're going to take this small cluster of Helsinki and Oslo. And all of a sudden, we see a big contrast with what was before. We have coastline, open sea, maybe a more suburban, urban pattern, less dense, etc. So I go through spaceness, through eventness in the abstract, and I translate to placeness, and this is what I get. So I get an idea of what Scandinavian Ness might be about, and I get images of open sea, snow, Scandinavian architecture, a little bit of selfies, maybe people that are dressed in a different manner, etc., etc. And the third door, we're going to try to enter through eventness. And what is interesting with eventness is that it has no relationship with the things of the world. Because eventness, remember, eventness is in the abstract. So spaceness is with Google Maps and the satellite images. Placeness is with Instagram and these cuts of space in time. But eventness is, what is eventness? Eventness is simply the relationship between space and time. So it's like some kind of space-time or chronotopical thing. And so what happens at eventness is that I can collapse it because I know the lexemes that we are talking with, but it only needs to go through space or time in order to be translated. So let's say that this would be the spaceness of the eventness of these post-Soviet cities. And we know that, yeah, it's similar to the European cities up there, but it's a little bit different. The scales of the buildings, the streets are larger, maybe more bars, maybe more collective housing, maybe bigger highways. And we're going to translate this and collapse it into placeness and see what happens. And all of a sudden I get a story of women, beauty products, parties, and a lot of advertisement, and then I collapse it several times to see if I find some consistency, and I find a consistency between the stories that are appearing. So I get the nails, things, beauty products, women, clothing. It comes over and over, and so on. So what this might tell me maybe is that social media has some kind of specific cultural use, which is around physical appearance. And for example, I could be more specific and say, okay, I like Tokyo, so tell me what Tokyo-ness could be about. So I can ask in any of these different manners. It doesn't matter because I can always translate. And when I render Tokyo-ness, first of all, we have a position inside the spectrum of eventness that we have here, and of course this is in the abstract. This is the aroma, this is the flavor, and I get a certain story about a lot of food, some nightlife, some architecture, a little bit of groups of people having drinks, and some artwork and advertisement. So this could be an idea of Tokyo-ness, and at the same time I could imagine in which kind of spacenesses this thing might happen. And I can project this back into space, and I could say, okay, if I'm in Tokyo and I really want to get the spirit of Tokyo, this is where I should go. Because the spirit of Tokyo is here in as much as it is here. And because these things happen together, in these things, there is Tokyo-ness. And so it gets more complex. You could say, okay, I love Tokyo-ness, but I like it somewhere else. So you could project it to other place. So the spectrum doesn't move, but now I'm in Seoul. And I want to find Tokyo-ness in Seoul. So what we have is a story that preserves this in lexicality, it preserves the food, it preserves the nightlife, it preserves the people, it preserves the artwork and the advertisement, but maybe the gradient changes a little bit. Maybe food is a little bit less important, and it's not Japanese food, it's Korean food. And in the spaceness metrics here, it shifted a little bit. And these are the spaces in Seoul where I might find Tokyo-ness. And I can do it. Oh no, what happened? Wait. And I'm getting farther away. Let's say from Tokyo I went to Seoul because Seoul is maybe the closest city to Tokyo, and now I'm going to Bangkok, which is close but is not as close as Seoul. So it's slowly we're getting farther away. In Bangkok, again, same indexes but inflected. Remember the idea of inflection with the lexeme. The spaceness model is not changing, but I'm changing the positions with it and projecting into actual space that get farther away. So this gets interesting. Melbourne. So physically far away, but topologically not so far away. I keep the same relationships, but maybe the groups are different. The groups are bigger. The food is not Asian food anymore. We have more architecture, more nightlife, but it always sends us to these very dense places that is found in Tokyo. And we can go to Vancouver, even farther away. And maybe little things start being introduced, like the importance of landscape. And it's like crazy, the power of this space of possibility, because the number of doors is infinite. So it's your imagination. So I'm gonna say, okay, this is fantastic. This is Tokyo-ness in Vancouver, but I really like this part. I just like this part. So I'm gonna go here. And when we zoom in and we go there, okay, there's some kind of infrastructures and bridges. I'm gonna explore the idea of richness. So look at the spectrum. The spectrum has moved. Richness, Tokyo-ness is up there, but richness is somewhere down here. And it doesn't have to be one point, it's an area. So richness is this pink thing. And this is a very generic idea of richness. It's just like some bridges together, but I'm gonna collapse it. So let's say richness in Köln. And when I think of richness in Köln, I have all this imaginary that I might have with Köln, like the lover padlocks on the bridge, and the selfies of couples on the bridge, and the sunset, the skyline, the bridge at night, etc., etc. And without the machine really knowing what this is, here I have all the bridges of Köln. I never told it what it was. And here I have a bunch of bridges that might have things like the things that are happening there. And as I start jumping from location to location, I have different feelings and moods about what richness could be. Okay, so in London is a different story. Maybe it's more high-tech or more monumental. Or I can go to Portland, and it's a different mood, but it's still this idea of richness. And as you can see, I'm moving in the spectrum. I had richness in Portland. I just moved one down, and I'm in richness still, but it's a slightly different richness. And what I could do now is that I'm gonna, let's say that I'm looking through richness to the many cities. I'm gonna transpose it, and I'm gonna look at the city through the many events. So let's take in Auckland, because we wanna know what the spirit of Auckland is about. And then I'm in richness now. Sunsets, I have this nice structure here, people by the water, etc., etc. I see where it's located, but I just need to move a little bit down in the spectrum, and it's no longer bridgeness, but it's watersideness. So waterside and bridge is like kind of close, and in this watersideness, I have something similar, but I don't see any bridge here. But I see what watersideness could be about. And I see that in physical space is really close, but it's different. And that's what else happens in Auckland. There's so many things happening in Auckland, and I just navigate in the spectrum. Concertness, there's, and whatever you find in a concert. And parkness, and sunsetness. And sunsetness is all on the water, because I suppose this is where you get the best views in Auckland. And then I could go on and on and on and on. So this is the navigation instrument. Now every time you take it out, you ask a question, you get a projection, and you go. So before we end, I just want to come back to the idea of the atlas. The atlas of atlases, remember, it's an atlas of atlases. So these differential records of the extreme diversity of the world. Photographs include abstractions and figures, mountains and cities, seas and realms, clouds and vegetation, landscapes and personal motifs, sketches and fields of color, Greenland and Venice, 1,000 complementary perspectives on a multiplicity always changing, a multi-spatial anything, where the great contradictions of contemporaneity can emerge too. The beauty and richness of our world seem to be at hand in a few digitations. Everything is changing, everything is animated. So we need to find new points of reference adapted to this condition. These things are vivid and alive, and they expose us to otherness and simultaneously to some degree of familiarity. It is exactly at the encounter of these two things that we are able to communicate or to create these bridges of communication. And as I started zooming out to get a wider outlook, my own world starts appearing. And this is what we are going to call home for today. But this can be re-articulated over and over and over. And because of this, we can say that we can be aliens at home. And this is planet Ness. Okay? This is our world Ness. This is where I live today. This is it.